Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the fourth talk, I think, of the series of AdTech Talks 6th edition. My name is Aude Christenba, and I am an invited curator at AdTech Lagos 2022. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce our three panelists to this conversation titled "The Future is Now." But before I start reading their bios, I would like to express my gratitude to each of them for accepting our invitation and for making some time for this. So today we are joined by David Alabo, Adeola Olanguju, and Bukola Oyebode, who will be moderating this conversation. David Alabo is a Ghanaian Moroccan multidisciplinary visual artist who features his work through an Afro-surrealistic sensibility, producing digital African landscapes that are at once speculative, familiar, and fantastical. These joyously colorful works demonstrate a wealth of influences ranging from the abstraction of artists such as Picasso to Maasai culture, an opposite reflection of a creative personality forged on 3 continents. Adeyola Olanguju works with photography, video, sound, and installation. Much of her practice involves consideration of the self, memory, spirituality, healing, and the social landscape. She was the recipient of the Seydou Keita Grand Prize for Best Photography Creation at the 12th edition of the Bamako Encounters Photography Biennale in 2019, the Lagos Photo Festival Award in 2012, and the Young Arts Support Amsterdam Award in 2013, And Adeola was one of the selected mentees at the 5th edition of the Forecast Forum in Berlin in 2020. Bukola Oyebode is an art writer and editor. She's the founder and lead editor of The Soul Adventurer, Art magazine. She has worked in the media since 2011 with experience in TV, television, print, and online. In 2017, she was a guest editor for the Intense Art magazine special publication on women's artists in Nigeria. In the same year, she was listed as one of the women shaping the Nigerian visual art. In 2020, she was recognized in Apollo 40 under 40 Africa as one of the 40 Africans whose works reflect the vitality and variety of the contemporary arts in Africa. Thank you, Adeola, David, and Bukola. But before giving the floor to Bukola, I would like to say to the people joining us today, there will be a 15-minute Q&A. Please, you can already prepare your question during the conversation. And when you send us your question in the chat, make a precision towards who you are addressing the question. Thank you. Over to you, Bukola. Have a good conversation.
thank you, Aude, for the introduction. And also thank you, Atex Lagos, for bringing us together for this conversation. Again, I am Bukola Oyebode, and I am having this conversation with Adeola Olanguju and David Alabo. I am excited about this conversation for many things. Because for the longest time, the idea of speaking about the future of Africa has always been a conversation that has happened from looking at the future as something that is so far away. But the title of, or the topic, or the way this conversation is framed is looking at the future of Africa as something that is already unfolding and already happening. And I really like that perspective. To begin, I want to establish some thoughts that I have for this conversation and how we can navigate the different topics that would come up. Is that I want to establish this question: who is shaping the future of Africa? Another concept that I would like us to get into in the process of discussing is the concept of time. How do we define time in Africa, and who is defining time for Africa? Another topic that I would also like to look at is the concept, or the way that the future of Africa, or the future of any place at all, is being framed as a singular notion instead of as multiple ideas or multiple futures, right? That as if future for a continent, for Africa, for instance, can be just one thing for a continent of 54 countries. And with this in mind, I will start from something that I glimpsed from Adeola's video titled Yabo, where the quote that said, "Falling can very well be flying if there's no tyranny of coordinates." So maybe we begin with Adeola. Are we flying or are we falling in Africa? Can you maybe get into your work as a way to establish where we are now and what you think?
Thank you very much, Bukola, and thanks, Aude, for the introduction. Thank you, David, and also thank you to the Artex team for, putting this together. When I received the curatorial invitation to be part of this project, and the first thing I saw is the restful ones are not born. And this aroused my curiosity. How do you mean? What does rest mean? What is restful? And then it's supposed to be under another complicated word, which is Africa and future Africa. And so the first question for me was like, what is Africa to start with? Because I'm Yoruba woman, and that's because I was born into that space. I speak the language, I understand the sensibility. I was named in this space. And so for Africa is a very, very complicated term for me. Firstly, when we look into the history, which we have as quote unquote Africans, and how the word Africa is constituted. What does it mean to be African? What does it mean to identify as Africa? What does it mean to my body as a person? Because the personal has always been the portal to looking into the collective for me. And so the recurrent ideas or themes, which are quite interesting for me also in my artistic practice, are like, the idea of like birth, of death, of rebirth, of, all things which constitutes this all being identifying. And so Africa has always been so complicated, for me to try to understand, to identify. And I think that is because looking at history, Africa is also not we concepted as. It's, it's like an entity which it was created or by whatever structures we had to deal with. And so also, if I bring it out to a place in Nigeria, at least I still identify as Nigeria. It's also a very complicated, discourse. And so I wanted to look into this nomenclature of what is Africa? What does it mean to be an African? And also to look into the concept of time. What is future? What does it mean? Is future this linear thing, that is happening? I move from here to the other place, and then, or is future, something that is happening now, and for me, I've always identified with, this whole concept, which is also coming from my culture, because I borrow a lot, because I've lived through this as the future, the past, and now as something which is interpenetrated. But how do I interpret this into my work? For instance, is to look into this idea of rebirthing of the self. What is the self? What does it mean to exist as an entity that is autonomous, which means you have your own thoughts, and so to look at the conception of Africa, which is, in a way, given to us. How do you find your own thought, which belongs to you? In this complex creation is one of the things which was very confronting for me, and which I wanted to explore with this video, which is, I don't know if it's trying to talk about just rebirth, but but more about talking about the consciousness of being aware of where we are in space, in time, and how we identify.
Thank you for that brief introduction of your work. However, I would like you to answer, do you think that Africa is falling or flying? From which perspective do you see where we are? And it's difficult because there are 54 continents, there are multiple ethnicities, we all gained independence at different times. It's like 60 years of post-independence for most African countries. Our progress has not been at the same pace. So it's a very complex question, I know, very difficult, but what is your perspective? What do you see, a falling or a flying, or are we even experiencing both at the same time?
From my perspective, I believe it's a juxtaposition of these things. I believe, Africa, quote unquote, is a space which is trying to birth itself. And that comes, with chaos and also confusion and destruction. And so one of the key points, which is also very interesting for me to explore, is that distress, and that chaos in Africa, something which is very productive. It's not, I was born into this chaos. I grew up during the military dictatorship in Nigeria. And so it's always been about that whole political economic distress. And that's been like the one story, but again, if we cast another gaze on this thing, it's about a space which is trying to birth itself. So it's not just about a chaos, and it's not totally negative, because of course, if you're trying to find your way, there's going to be a lot of misses, until you come into that knowledge. And I think coming into the knowledge, as a singular act is the element of future, which I really think is very, very interesting for me as a person to say that, the future is also the personal, the realization and birthing a new consciousness. And so to go back to your question, the idea of falling or flying and, is a mixture of what is happening in the continent to speak, and not just one thing.
Or the other. Thank you. David Alabo, let's go into your work, 3 Futures, 1 Africa.
Hi, yes. Thank you for having me here.
What are these 3 futures that you see? Are you taking inspiration from the past, or are you projecting 3 different futures that are completely new and hypothetical based on your own imagination?
Yes, kind of similar to what Adeola was talking about in terms of when we were given the brief, the restful ones are not yet born. It's difficult to sort of think, and I think it almost does a bit of a disservice to the continent to just see it as one big thing. So with me personally, I decided the only way I could be true to myself and the art that I make is to have it be personal, or have it be my own interpretation or my own state of consciousness. And that's the only way I could possibly speculate on the future of the continent, because for me, I feel like I'm representing different parts of Africa, from obviously my base in Accra, Ghana, but also my Moroccan heritage, and sort of asking myself all these questions. So with the project, 1 Africa, 3 Futures, it is as much informed by the past as it is not trying to be bound by it. So that's the challenge that we face, is that how much of the past influences our speculations on the future. So with this project, I mean, the three futures I sort of envisioned were very personal to me in a way that they were almost like dreamlike and surreal in nature, you know. So one particular world is very much inspired by our history and our sort of the things that we considered traditionally important to us, whether it's like folklore or whether it's the cultural things. And then another world is kind of an extension of the world we live in now, which is what I did for the online experience, you know. So the message with that one is that we're living in a world that's very much dominated by technology in a way that empowers us, but also limits us, because we're still trying to control these spaces that are very much not in the hands of people that look like us. So we are in a struggle right now to reclaim these spaces in the world we live in. So that's why I kind of extended it into the immersive virtual reality experience, because I felt like the fair needed the audience to almost be a participant in the artwork, in experiencing these speculations, and to have them understand that they're visiting my idea, and my reflections on the future will be very different from another African sitting next to me. So it is a challenge, but that's the beauty of it, in that we're allowed to sort of display all this range of ideas and sort of concepts that we have in the future, you know. And then the last one was more of a dystopian, apocalyptic view of the future, in a sense that also, you know, as I've been working on this project, I've just been inspired by my fellow artist Adeola, as I have been with my own work, you know, in exploring the nature of chaos and destruction, and how that can also lead to rebirth and growth, you know. So it has felt a bit like almost a collaborative effort in terms of like being brought together by Africa No Filter and ArtX to work on this. So that last future is sort of speaking into environmental issues. How are we dealing with the future of Earth, the sustainability of the planet, and how do we view that as a continent? Is that something we place importance in, or is that something that we don't, you know? So that destruction is what eventually leads to growth and a change. So these were all the sort of the themes that were playing in my head when we were given the project, you know. So I feel like I did a good job of trying to explain what goes on in my head, you know. And the reception so far to both of the works, at least I've seen here in the physical, was amazing, you know. And it generated a lot of conversation and a lot of different perspectives, whether people agree or not, you know. At least it has them talking about what the future of Africa means to them on a personal level, you know. So yeah, in short, that's kind of the experience so far.
Thank you for sharing that, David. From what I hear, it seems that the journey to get into the desired future that we have for Africa has to begin from the mind, from a creative and imaginative space. And in that sense, I'm thinking, how can we make this idea a dominant part of the way Africa is the way the future of Africa is approached? I mean, from the creative spaces is already happening, but it's not the dominant thought on the entire continent. You talked about chaos. Adeola also talked about chaos. Last year alone, when you look at Africa, and especially at a time when COVID-19 was going on, global pandemic, worldwide health crisis, Africa was also experiencing different kinds of uprisings. For example, in Cameroon, there was the Angolan crisis, an Anglophone crisis that has been going on, which also like kind of intensified. And there was an NSAS situation in Nigeria, ending with the old Lekki massacre that is still controversial, or whether there's a group of people that believe that the massacre happened or not. And if I look into other parts of Africa, there are other kinds of crises going on. And in the years before, even up until now, I think there's the genocide, Afrophobia in South Africa. I mean, in the context of all of these things, this chaos, this destruction, I'm thinking, how can we begin to make an imaginative path to a more to an Africa that is without chaos? Because do we necessarily need chaos to get to where we are going? And if we speak of chaos, are we speaking of this kind of chaos or a more constructive chaos? Because these are two different things. And how do you deal with or approach this kind of thoughts? I mean,
Yeah.
Adeola or David can.
Okay, I speak a little bit about specific to my work, at least. I would consider there are different types of chaos, and I mean, it is almost like a law of nature that like something can never be, energy can't be destroyed, it can only be converted from one form to another. So in a way, it's like you do need that chaos in order for change to happen, or for people to realize that the systems or the world they live in isn't built for them, and it's time for it to be reconstructed for them and not for us to fit in, you know. It's more built for us. So I mean, one example specific to the work, as I mentioned before, is the environmental nature of the work I made. You know, as the more I explained the work over the course of the few days I've been here in Lagos, the more I realized the sort of environmental activist message kind of weave through it, you know, in a way like we have been predicted as a world, or as the earth, that it's dying, you know. Climate change is really something that everybody has to pay attention to. And it's only recently that I feel like people have started talking about this, and in respect to us as a people, like, you know, when even down to sort of the taxes they place on carbon emissions from countries, and sort of all the systematic, you know, oppressions they do with respect to that, that alone is a form of chaos. And that's something that we're gonna have to deal with if we want to basically have a future, you know, have a future as a continent. It's time we start thinking about sort of rebuilding these systems to fit us, and not have other people sort of tell us where to fit in, if that makes sense.
But chaos has been a part of the continent since independence. How much more do we need to get to our desired end? You know, Adeola, I'm thinking about you in this kind of question, because I remember a quote by, and I do agree with you, David, actually, that chaos is needed as a way and a part of the process, because I remember something Kada Atia wrote when the NSAS crisis was going on in Lagos last year, where he said, we are educated to think that everything can be repaired. And when we face something that really challenges us, we freak out, we suffer. I think that I'm trying to put repair at the center of, okay, no, sorry, I have the wrong quote, but there was a quote where he talked about injury as part of the process to repair, right? But what kind of injury do we still need to get to a point of repair, a point of solution, a point of peace? This is enough. We have arrived at a desired end.
Thank you very much. Bukola, and thank you, David, for your responses. Um, Personally, I'm going to come back to a space like Lagos, and I'm going to look specifically at NSAS as something very generative. And nothing like that has ever happened in the history of Nigeria, and we saw a different kind of energy. We saw people who were willing to die to make a statement. I mean, I grew up at a time where we were literally bullied, by the military. I mean, and we were really careful as to what can be said, about the government and all whatnot. But a new revolution is also happening in the continent. If we look at a lot which has happened, is the fact that some people rose and said, we demand this. Either that demand is being met is another point of conversation, but the desire, the need, and the courage that is happening, I believe this is very, very constructive for whatever future is going to happen in a place like Nigeria, which means there's been conversations, there's been dialogue, which is very productive around change. I mean, we also having this conversation is also contributing to this discourse. And I do believe, sometimes people think like, change is something that is going to be cataclysm, something's just going to erupt and there's change, but it's also very gradual. It's also having this conversation, is also being in a space where I'm having conversation with my friends around, oh, why don't you get a paper bag rather than a plastic? Because sometimes we assume people know, but they don't. And also, I mean, David said something about people having conversations about climate change. And my question is, who are these people? Because we realize that the conversation about climate change is mostly coming from the Western part. It's not really a local discourse, because I mean, the guy at your gates right there in Lagos does not even understand, like, why shouldn't he use his, a plastic bag? And to also look at, what is generating this plastic in these spaces, in the first place, which is capitalism, and these are like multiple problems that if people, don't get to the core of whatever it is, which is, going to come from a place of like reflection. And I tell you, things like reflection is luxury, because when someone is trying to survive, the last thing on their mind is reflection, because there's no space. You can barely sleep enough. How much more reflect? So this whole space, creating discourses, I mean, generating like conversations like this, for instance, to be moments of reflection where we're able to, think about like what kind of future, do we want for ourselves? I mean, and we always go personal, first, because I like to take things on a micro level to say, if I'm talking about this, Bukola is talking about it, and David is talking about it. And we also have like maybe two or other three people around us who will share this with. And then, gradually it's about this consciousness, about, our consciousness changing, and then we're able to, maybe physically affect these changes in our environment. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Adeola. But how can we move this consciousness that is happening in the creative space, in the arts and culture spaces, to the mainstream, for instance? Because often we are having these conversations in silos, and it's great, but how does it transcend this kind of space into the mainstream? How does it become? Because when I look at the work Iyabo, I see that the idea of rebirth has to start with the individual. But how many individuals are aware of their role in the path to change?
I mean, if we have to go pedagogical, for instance, and I think it begins with personal education, and we all have like personal responsibility, and this is not a time to think like something is going to happen outside of ourselves. I mean, I'm having this conversation, and you having this conversation, and you have your own platform with whatever it is that you do, which is to educate, to talk about, arts in the continent. David is making his work, which is like, and people consume this. And so, I mean, sometimes there's no way to evaluate how much has been taken out of this, but it goes into some places, which I believe it goes into people's subconscious. And some things are not just, they're not immediate, I mean, a lot of people have been into the fair, they've seen these works and all these things. There's no way to say how much has been taken away from it. And so we also don't have control on how people transmute whatever it is that is taken away. But I believe something has been taken away, from the works, from the conversation or whatsoever. But on a personal level, I believe we can begin to do things in our own small way, because another construction, which I think really needs to be destroyed in African thought, is about, our modernism and institutions, are going to, if we don't have like the big architectures, museum and all these things, we don't have institution. I believe this is an institution. We're having this conversation already exists. And so we can take these small dialogues into different places. This is happening here. I do workshops, David does, odd curate. This is continually, dealing with these themes of, Africa imaginary. How do we generate our own thoughts and find our own local solutions to, address our own local problems, and not waiting for something to come outside of ourselves or outside or from the West, because the African solution is going to come from Africa.
Thank you. When you say African solutions is going to come from Africa, there's also the aspect of the outsider, the ones who are speculating and projecting negative economic positions for Africa. And on the one hand, they are projecting negative positions. On the other hand, they are saying Africa is the future. Oftentimes, I find it confusing. What exactly do you have or know that makes you very decisive about what kind of economic or political future Africa will have? How do we gain ownership of that kind of narrative and also how much role does the economic aspect play in how we arrive at a certain kind of future, the one where poverty is no longer the synonymous to the narrative of Africa? I mean that is very much changing now, but also it's still on imbalance, that when you think of Africa, there's poverty on one hand, and then there's, of course, progress and glamour and wealth on the other hand, but there's also corruption limiting the distribution of this wealth. How can all of this change? How do you wrap your head around this when you create the kind of works that you do, and hope that the public can sort of gain a new consciousness from looking at these works? David, maybe you want to speak to this, because in your work you have three different narratives. And in one of them, there's the idea of technology. How does technology interweave with the economic and political situation? And how can that shape or radically transform our present to a better future?
Yeah, I think you touch on a lot of interesting points, Bukola. I think personally for me, I see, like, you ask how do these maybe outsiders or people decide that Africa is the future. I think it's obvious in the sense that the most important asset, or I don't want to say asset, or the most important power or currency is people, and in Africa, we are the largest growing youth population. And so that brings us back to the point about, like, who are we educating, or who are we sharing our state of mind or our consciousness or our speculations with? It's with the next generation or our peers, and I think that's why it's so important that Adeola and I were invited to this, because it's important that we also take control of the media and the mediums in which we tell these stories, and how do we show people that it's we are, like, taking control and using new technology or new mediums to speculate on the future, So I think it's important that we show people that look like us can occupy spaces like that, because that's how we inspire a next generation, is if they can look and see that I can be in that position or higher, I can go even beyond us and occupy the places where they can stop corruption, or they can sort of take a stand against oppression against us, And if you're not there, you can't decide on the future of anything if you're not in the spaces deciding these things. So on a creative sense or on a personal level, we've taken this sort of challenge upon us in order to always try to explore and find new ways to tell these stories, because at the end of the day, the people that are also receiving this information, like we talked about, we have to also consider how maybe on a more physiological level, how their brains have been hardwired, you know, how they consume content, how they share information, and the ways in which we share this information. If we bring it back to even the End SARS movement, you know, how was information spread? How was communication made? Because communication is the way with which you get people together, and you get people to realize that something needs to change. If they don't know, or if they're blinded or obscured by what's happening, they can never realize that, hey, if you and I get together, maybe we can do something about this. So that's where I think the technological side of things happen. And we have to find a way, at least as artists, how do we use this technology to further our cause, you know? So yeah, that's just a short answer to a very deep, long, extensive question, if you know what I mean.
Yes, I do. But let's move away from the idea, from all of the previous ideas, and move into the language that is being used to discuss Africa. So for example, I'm thinking of the idea of future. Why are we not in the future now? And that's why I like the topic or the title used for the conversation. The future is now. If the future is now, what is happening? And do we consider this the best that can come out of Africa? Are we in that space where we can say we can relax? But then I look again at the larger theme of the art fair. The restful ones are not yet born. Again, it evokes it's quite provocative, because it means that it's not time for rest, right? So that's another thing to look at in terms of language, you know, the future rest. And also, I'm thinking about time, you know. If you look at America today, America has been an independent nation for how long? But it's still wrestling with a lot of crises, racism, for example, you know. But yet, Africa is still a child when you compare it to a country like the America. And you were thinking, maybe we still need a longer time to get to where we have been expected to be already right now. All of these things, you know, language is a very powerful thing, and it imposes as well as dominates, right? And you were thinking the restful ones are not yet born, but for the last 60 years, there has been efforts made to shape this continent, to push it forward, to make changes. Changes are happening simultaneously as a lot of things are going wrong. And then you were thinking about all the other things that has been put forward. Adeola, for instance, believed that time is cyclical, so it's never linear. So we could be in a time of chaos now, but it does not mean that we have always been in a time of chaos or that things will continue to be like that. How can we start to decolonize the language that is being used to frame narratives on the continent by us and by outsiders, even from the works that we make?
Wow. Thank you very much, Bukola. You know, I mean, language is a very tricky thing, because of course it implicates you. And I think we as quote unquote Africans, we have a deep burden of trying to interpret or translate our thoughts through this language, which is not us. I mean, I can say a whole lot of things better in Yoruba. I speak Yoruba in 4 different dialects, and you understand nuances and sounds and all these things, which I cannot squeeze into the 2 foreign languages, which I speak now, English and German. But the point which I'm trying to make is, like, we carry this burden of like finding a way to express ourselves. And so because of also like the history which we have, we find ourselves a lot of times, you know, that all we have to do is to appease the Western sensibilities of what it means to be intellectual, you know, what it means to have a future. And so I believe a reconception of what our future needs to be, also needs to be redefined by us to say what is modern to us as Africans. What is better for us? Because sometimes these Western constructions does not work for us and is not for us. And I realize also that, of course, we're burdened, because you started this, of course, questions around like, economic, whatever. Yeah, there's like, we have independence on paper, good, but are we actually independent? Do we have independent thoughts? Do we like, and also when we try to, for instance, we go through, layers and layers of all these like complications with how we define ourselves and what we use to validate ourselves, our foreign degrees, how that in a way, quote unquote, push us up certain ranks, and so a market woman is seen as illiterate. And my question is, why is she illiterate? Because she cannot speak English? Or, what about a knowledge which is so deep and vital? What about how they speak? So, everything turns, if you cannot speak like, the academic way, you're not intelligent. What about a whole lot, which is like loaded in our own poetry and how we navigate and make sense of things. And so all these things need to come into the fore. I guess, a good example of it is also like what myself and David has tried to do, and trying to interpret our own Africa imagination. I went in the way of like, magical realism. It went into, free tourism. And I think this is very interesting because it also shows that, this whole concept of future is also not one thing. The way I see it is not the way David sees that, it's like, it's like a product of many subjectivities. And so we're navigating life and thinking like, our future is, going in a way, some people have expectation of us. And so they project their own insecurity on us by saying there's going to be this and that. And then they're going to project another thing. Why are we sitting in the space where, we're subject of other people's projections? Why don't we, withdraw, and kind of like come into a space of where we own our own thoughts, on our own independence. And I believe like the genuine independence is going to come from our own minds, because sometimes, you look at it, if I feed you, then I'll tell you what to do. And so the conversation also needs to start from a place of how do we begin to do our own things, fund our own selves. And sometimes you look at, we can't do this, we need a whole lot of money. But first, the independence and the will to be able to do it has to come from, a personal space to say, this is my thought. It's very relevant and it can stay on its own without the projection of people telling me this is how it needs to be. To create a space where we allow ourselves to come into being, allow that exist on its own without the foreign projections of this is what we think it should be. And I think is that all coming into our own self-knowledge and allowing ourselves to be confident in who we are, both on a personal level and also on a collective level.
Yeah, you can speak to that also, David.
Yeah, I agree. I don't know what else to add, but all I could say is like, yeah, I feel like we're at a bit of a crossroads right now. We're at a point where there's an opportunity for radical change for the positive or for the negative, depending on sort of the steps we take. At the end of the day, we could sit here and talk forever about what we could do, but it's about actively creating, creating and sharing. And we are at a point at like in 2021 where like you can connect to anybody across the world, so you can actually share things you've created, stories you've told, films you've made, music you've made on a way that shows, like Adeola said, the breadth and scope of the African mind, or how diverse we can all sort of speculate. And it's in that conversation between the things we create that it almost like feeds into itself in a way that like it generates more discussion, it generates more collaboration. It puts us, coming back to what I keep repeating, is that it puts us in spaces where we can control our own autonomy, we can have independence. Like you said, we've only been officially on paper independent from most countries for 60+ years. That's nothing in the scope of the history of humanity, you know. So sometimes we are looking at things on a kind of a small scale, and we do have to realize that we are only now reclaiming autonomy over our creation, over our media, and it's only a matter of time before you can't not hear us. You know, we're gonna be everywhere. You know, so it's positive, and it gives me hope, at least, you know, because I know that the future of Africa is now, and it's going to be prevalent and important for these next generations to come, only because, like I said, we're gonna have access to more content from here. And I mean content not in like Instagram posts, I'm talking about content in
creativity,
in like manifesting what is in your head into tangible objects or tangible information to consume, you know. So even looking at it on a very like technical level, I see a lot of hope for the continent in the next, even in the next 10, 20 years, or even shorter, you know. It's radical. So we need to do more of this, you know, more discussion, more creating, more sharing. And like I said, going back to how we are the largest population, the largest population, that only adds to my sort of sense of optimism for the country and the continent. And I mean, even specifically to my country, Ghana, Morocco, you know, even getting these places that were previously not even considered in the same space, you know, when you even talk about the North African and West African divide, or East Africa, you know, it's like now I'm a living embodiment of that sort of cross-cultural interchange, you know. I mean, I'm yet to meet another Ghanaian Moroccan, but I'm sure there's some out there. If you're here, if you're listening, shout me out. But you know, it's like we're getting to a place where we're gonna have more collaboration across the continent, and that's gonna change the perspective and what is considered stereotypically African, you know. And even with the works we're creating now, the new media, the new thoughts, you know, the magical realism of Adeola's work and sort of the futuristic nature of mine, is only gonna allow even more birth of ideas, you know, coming to the issue of rebirth and chaos. So I'm genuinely optimistic, but I know that we need to get things right, you know, in these next few years.
Thank you for those contributions, David. And actually, I want us to get into the art of these works, because, you know, you talked about the amount of creativity of the kind of new imaginations coming out of Africa, the collaborations that are possible, you know. And I'm looking at the amount of technology that has been, the kind of technology that has been utilized to create these new works, you know. I remember when I shared your work and Adeola's work yesterday, the first comment somebody made to me from where I am, I mean, somebody who also stays in Amsterdam and who follows me on Instagram, said, "Are you sure these are African artists?" I was like, yes, of course, yes, these are African artists. And this really makes me happy and proud, you know, that there's somebody who is looking at the work of an African artist and second guessing, is that indeed an African artist? And we need to really build on that kind of curiosity that is coming out of how people look at African art or African artists. So let's talk about the media, the work. For example, in your work, for example, David Alabo, you are really sitting in a part of, you're working from an aspect of digital art that is still considered unutilized or relatively not utilized on the continent. You work with virtual reality, you do immersive art, and all of this, play around with technology a lot. Talk about the process of creating One Africa, Three Futures, the kind of technology that is involved. What does it mean to work as a digital artist, and how do you create in such a surrealistic landscape, a futuristic space? How do you translate that from what used to be something painted into something that we have to experience by moving our cursors? And, you know, tell us about this kind of things.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think, you know, the term, you know, I consider myself an Afrofuturist, you know, and that's a term that's a bit like, you know, controversial almost, you know, but in my own personal definition of Afrofuturism, it is sort of reinterpreting or, you know, shifting the perspective of classical ideas, but using like new technology, you know, and like I said before, you know, the way in which we consume information is just as important as the information we consume, you know. So working with this project, it was important that not only do we, like I said, break the stereotypical ideas of what is considered African art, you know, and challenge that, but also how do we experiment? How do we innovate in ways that can sort of attract audiences or attract attention to our work, you know? So on the technological side of things, we played around with several different ideas. Odd, the curator of the experience, and talked a lot about how is the best way we can sort of showcase all this work. So what I tried to achieve with this one was, how can I blend the physical world that we live in, reality, with this digital world, you know, because we're entering a time where, you know, COVID, the pandemic, the lockdown, and even the last 20 years have been gearing us up to be almost fully digital, you know. So it's important now for artists like myself working in this space to be trying to push the boundaries of the tech involved in the art, you know. So specifically with One Africa, Three Futures, like I mentioned before, the online digital display of it, there was a message even in that. There was a message in the fact that I chose a specific world to have in the digital experience, because it's also, I'm trying to share light on how technology can be empowering, but also extremely limiting, you know. So I was faced with that issue of like, how do I get the audience to feel like they are part of the art, but also understand that they're just visitors to my speculations, you know, and my speculations aren't absolute, and they're personal, and they're not what is considered right, you know. But at the end of the day, I did want some autonomy with the user to feel like they have come into this world that I created, and give them a sense of almost wonder in navigating this virtual reality experience, you know, and using your phone. So the message is that like everything we're looking at is through our phones, and you can see it as a negative or you can see it as a positive, you know. And the negative in the sense that from your phone, you can do like 1,000 different things to help your cause, or you could have a phone and there'll be 1,000 things that will distract you from actually doing any, you know, productive, you know, anything productive for your cause, you know. So these are things that the technological side of showing the art is just as important, like I said, as the content you make. So those are things that we took into consideration, and I believe that people were receptive to it, because some people didn't like the physical exhibition I had there. They thought it was too much for their eyes, you know, and I understand that it was too much visually for them to consume. But when I showed them the digital one, and they were the ones doing it at their own pace, you know, I'm not forcing them to go at any rate, they were much more receptive to it. So like I said, we're trying to create as much as we can for as many people, as many Africans as we can, you know.
Okay, can you also speak about the humanoids and the kind of nature that exists alongside these futuristic spaces of high rises and all of that? this choice of representations?
Yeah, so I mean, another theme, there were like lots of little maybe sub-themes and subliminal messages I may have hidden through the art, but one of them with this sci-fi version of this world that's powered by technology is also like exploring outside of space, outside of Earth, you know, because going back to this environmental point is that the Earth isn't sustainable. Eventually, we're going to have to leave here and explore other parts of the universe, not now, but very soon, you know, sooner than we expect. So how do we claim these spaces? Do we start from scratch, given that it's a new canvas, a new sort of playground, or do we bring in things we consider part of our heritage here to these unexplored, untouched areas? So that was also me kind of exploring like an Africa beyond even the physical Earth, you know, like beyond even Earth, you know, like I even consider it not just the continent, you know, it's more than that. So how do we even explore into space as Africans? Are we even in control of the means of getting there, the means of occupying these places? So the humanoids, like you mentioned, was me trying to imagine how we could look in space, or how we could represent ourselves in space. So that was just a way of me speculating on sort of the physical nature of how we look in these unexplored places. So if you look at the work, I'm not sure if I can show it, but Africa is there, but everything is happening. The Earth is there, but everything is happening around it. So you know that we've already left Earth and we're exploring all these new places. So that was the theme of that specific version of the future of Africa, thinking about exploring space and leaving Earth, you know. Something important to consider as well, you know, given that you're seeing billionaires and stuff flying casually into space, and it's like,
Yeah.
like you don't need to go to space, like you don't need to go to space. So those are things that just go through my mind, and I feel like it's also going through the minds of a lot of people when we see these kind of news, you know.
Thank you for answering that question, David. Before now, we are already getting into question and answers from people watching. But before I read out the first question, I quickly want to ask Adeola to also take us through the process of our work, the kind of technology involved, because I mean, this was not like a video, old school, traditional style, camera in hand, shooting a body falling from the sky, creating umbilical cords cutting out of the globe and all of that. What kind of technology was involved? How did you conceive this? How did you execute and bring us this very unusual imagery that we are watching today?
Thank you very much. I mean, in my case, like the theatrical has always been like, you know, very important to me. The performative, I'm very interested in body, which goes across almost all of my works. And so for this work, which I actually wrote during the first lockdown in 2020. And so every time I looked at it, and I'm like, oh, I don't have all the technical or technological skill set personally to make the project by myself. So I thought, oh, again, this is like the space for collaboration. So I worked with a digital studio of a very good friend of mine, and also I worked with a sound person to design. You know, I came up with the ideas. I wrote my script and the treatment of what is happening or what will happen in every of the scene with details, where the camera comes from and all these things. Because of course I realized, like, this is also, tapping into that whole imaginary space is like one of the things which is also very important to me. And so I brought like professionals who are very skillful at the things which they do together, to interpret this. I also work with a performer, Rita Thelma, which, is very fantastic in bringing this, idea to life. And also the sound was very important to me because I was very specific about, like, drums and, the things which are quite symbolic, to practices. What does, what does it mean when it's upbeat, when it's melancholic, how does that work together also with the work? And also, I mean, fantasy. I mean, I grew up when hearing tales of tortoise talking, and as a child, I could literally see it. It's almost like witchcraft, whatever that means. And also to borrow from personal mythology. I mean, as a child, I had so much dreams. Either I'm falling from the sky or jumping into the water. And so these are like really chaotic, which nightmarish dreams. And this became things which was very relevant, and also to put the personal into the story of, but yeah, I work with people technically to realize this work.
Thank you. So I'm gonna start with the first. Do you want to speak to what our response said, David?
Yeah, no, I just wanted to say, Adeola, I love the work so much. Before I came here to do the video call, I was actually watching it one more time just so, to refresh it. And there's a scene where it's raining and, there's this cyclone coming and it was pouring here. So, I mean, I don't know whether you planned it or anything, but the immersion was amazing. Like you could hear on hitting the tents of the art fair, the rain, and then you're watching it and everybody was just like, oh my God, what's gonna happen next, So it was really like, I mean, you nailed it. So thank you for that. It was amazing.
Thank you very much. I allow myself take it in. Thank you very much.
Yes, so I will start with the first question from Honoria de Ohobase. He says, thanks for the discussion. I'm curious about how you both see the role of abstraction as a language in your work and this future imagining. So this question goes to both of you.
Adeola, I'll let you go.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say David, and then you called my name first. Yeah. I really believe even the term future is abstract. What is future? Not something, it's not tangible. And so how does one interpret what one cannot see? So it's also not reality, it's borrowing, a collage of subjectivities. And what do you make of that? It's like talking about smell. I don't see it. It's like, and how do I interpret that if I want to make work? And so this became something which was also like, okay, how do we go within ourselves to speak about things which we've never seen, to look into our own personal and ancestral history? I mean, I just spoke about like how a personal story of my nightmare became the chaos or the distress which I put into my own work, and how do we look at the things. I mean, I grew up at the days where I wasn't watching this thing, I was watching Yakin Ajileye, which is like one of the foremost filmmakers in Nigeria, in Osogbo, when Osogbo was like the headquarters of Nollywood, and these were people who are dealing with phantasmagoria, were dealing with like, things which people will call fetish, and say, oh, the witches, the white witch and the black. I grew up on this content, which was very interesting, like the imagination, that brought to life whatever it is that they created. And so I will say all these things influence how I see the world, how I perceive the world. Trees are not just trees to me, because I'm looking at why is the shape like this, why, they're like beings to me, I mean, I feel the texture, like why does this feel this way? And all these things is on my own perception of life, and find a way to interpret that. So I think, yeah, I think this is like the best way to interpret this whole idea of like, time, of future, of being, of body and spaces. Thank you.
And David?
I mean, yeah, I think there definitely needs to be more surrealism and abstraction in the art also, because yeah, like it's also important not to just create art that is maybe almost force feeding a message, in a way that it should be like a mirror to the person watching it, for them to sort of gather their own experiences and relate it to their own life, So sometimes the only way I feel that I can personally do that is like almost like, you know, Adeola said, like dream-like kind of state of consciousness, you know, and then in creating art that sort of doesn't have a very, like, let's say, clear-cut definition almost, or opinion sometimes, it allows you to tap into the subconscious of the audience, you know, and the person and the people that are absorbing your content, you know, and it, like I said, it gives enough room for interpretation and open-endedness that they can very much relate it to themselves. If it's too far away from them, it's not going to be relatable. And it sounds funny. It sounds almost like against what I'm saying, but the weirder you get, or the further into this territory of the strange and the surreal you get, the easier it is actually for someone to relate to the art that you create. So I have to agree with Adeola when we say that it's like we almost have to share these kind of surreal dream-like interpretations, because that's the only way you can speculate on something as broad and extensive as the topic, the future of Africa, you know. It's something that is not, you can't define in one thing. It has to be your own reflection or your own thoughts and experiences. So yeah, I think that's kind of why we've been brought together for this, you know, for this show. And also, like I've been saying throughout the fair, we're giving something different, something fresh to what you consider a contemporary art fair, you know. So we're showing people that African art can be weird, it can be surreal. You don't have to get it even, you know. So even if you don't get it, that's not a problem, you know. Someone else will get it.
Right. I'm also thinking of the role of related how do you make sorry for that, how do you create from the point of thinking of how it can be relatable to the audience? Because again, when I look at Adeola's work and I think of an audience outside of our the local context that mainly inform that work, the language of the work immediately becomes abstract and perhaps not relatable in the way that she imagines the work would be relatable. So again, there's subjectivity going on in that sense, and also context. And I mean, for you, David, your context is the internet, the World Wide Web. In some sense, you create with a language that is unique to that space, even though you try to infuse your local experiences, local surroundings, knowledge, history, past, present, and imaginings into the work. But the work is also expressed and communicated in a language that is very digital, that is very internet-like, that is very Afro-futuristic, and there's a particular audience for that would not find it abstractive or abstracted, but find it like natural and easy to relate with, in a way that you then think that abstraction and language and framing are also very subjective things, you know.
Yeah.
I'm going to quickly read this.
Sorry to, I mean, before we continue, I mean, this takes me back to like what we talked about earlier, which is, you know, the old discussion about language, you know. I mean, I think it's also very important that we're careful when we concept our works as to, because I mean, an artist is not also creating from a place of like, oh, how do I want people in America to relate to this? You know, how do I want people in Africa to relate to this? I mean, this wouldn't be a question to European artists, for instance, who makes his work, his or her work. And then if I go to the museum, it doesn't matter where I've come from, I'm expected to look at his work and engage with them. And so when it comes to like the context of Africa, it's as though there's always like a burden of like, oh, explain to this, what does this mean in your work? Even in literature, there's like over description and all these things. And in a way, I feel it's tricky, because then it can be reductive also to people who are trying to push boundaries and so the work is also an invitation for engagement. There's always something that belongs to somebody in any kind of work, even if it's the color. If that's the only thing that you pick from it, then that's okay. But I don't think it's also like the burden of the artist to start thinking, oh, when this leaves Africa, what are those Americans? I think that's another burden which like the word is put on African creatives, on African works, which is very important to watch out and be careful of, especially when we talk about our own works and also about our own selves. I just want to put that out there.
Interesting, because the second question actually goes to you and it's related to this kind of context. The question says, for Adeola, how do you consider the reading or the reception of your work having magical realism as a foundation in a context such as Nigeria, where religions are part of the society? The question was sent in by someone who did not declare his or her name, anonymous. So, I mean, you already kind of answered that a bit, but maybe you want to extend it to the religion aspects.
I mean, like, things like religion in a place like Nigeria is like a very fragile territory to step on, because again, Nigeria is a religious space, but it's also an highly cultural space. So I think people will look at it either ways, I mean, if we look at Christianity, for instance, and then you also look at the Yoruba traditional religion, and you look at like the early churches, they borrowed a lot from the white garment churches, they took a whole lot of like sensibilities, from like the Yoruba practices with the things they do, they created a new language, they created a new way of doing certain things. And I don't think there should be a conflict if we are not resisting, whatever it is that is in front of us. But I cannot necessarily say how a religious person will look at it, because again, consuming art is also a very personal experience. But for me, the most important thing is I need to do my work and I get it done. So I did my part. And so it's also, and I invite people to do their part by looking at it or not, because that also exists. You don't have to look at it if it's not for you.
Right. I will go quickly to the third question. It says, in contemplating Black quantum futurism, in your opinion, how does the African future and diaspora impact how you revisit and perhaps even shift the past through your work, and how you collaborate with other artists? This question was sent in by AJ Hines.
Hey, Jay. That's a tough question. Can you repeat it again?
Okay, maybe I break it into two. It says, the question says, in contemplating Black quantum futurism, how does the African future and diaspora impact how you revisit and perhaps even shift the past through your work?
How do I mean, I don't actually think about this specifically, but if I were to give an answer, I would say like, maybe sort of what I'm trying to do is like revisit sort of my own personal experiences growing up, and sort of absorbing all these stories and memories and experiences as African. But I feel like in a way I am recontextualizing it through my medium, which is, like you said, the internet and technology, in a way that I'm like preserving it, and I'm preserving it, but in a way I'm giving new life to it, a new perspective on it. So I mean, it's tough. I can't put it down exactly, but like when we speculate on the future, it's almost impossible not to look into the past. And we had this conversation about the tension between trying to let go of the past and sort of how it's affected us, but also trying to speculate without being influenced by it. So that's a challenge. I mean, AJ herself is an incredible I would consider her an Afrofuturist herself in terms of the music she makes, you know. So I feel like it's up to artists to revisit the past, revisit our history, our personal history, but also be conscious of how that affects your speculations on the future, and not have it so much influenced by it, but maybe guided, you know, gently guided by it, you know. So
okay, I think we have to wrap up. I keep getting the prompts from Old and the Architects Collective team that we have to wrap up. I think it has been nice having this conversation. It's quite broad, and I'm wondering how much time would have been needed to really get to the hearts of some topics that are necessary to discuss. But I think we have managed to discuss some important aspects, from your work to the ideas of what it means to discuss the future of Africa. I mean, this is a very broad and complex conversation, but I'm sure that we have touched on something, and it could mean something for how this conversation is carried on. I want to say something that was written by Achille Mbembe in an essay that he wrote 10 years ago on where Africa is going, and looking at the 50 years of African decolonization. In that essay, he said, for us to achieve all of the things that we desire for Africa, it will be above all necessary to move beyond the logic of emergencies, always treating Africa from the point of emergencies, of not creating long-term plans and not creating ideas that are actually looking into the future, as opposed to how we eat now, how we create solutions for now, and our immediate needs that has until now colonized the debate about the future of Africa. I also want to add that for us to get to the future that we desire for Africa, the idea of looking to the resources, the natural resources, looking to the land, looking to all of these things that we have always looked to in the past, we'll have to shift from that to looking to the people, like David said, as a way going forward. And I think, and also to point out that the mind is the first point of change, as Adeola has indicated in her work. And on that note, I want to say thank you to everybody who joined us. That until next time, we hope we can have a longer conversation. Thank you, ArtX. Thank you, thank you everyone for listening and watching. And Bukola, bye.
thank you.
Thank you very much.
Pleasure.
Thank you.